Today is a great day. I got a lot of messages this morning informing me that Ada Limon has now been named our newest National Poet Laureate. The tone of the messages varied. I wouldn't say any was exactly thrilled, but I have sort of mixed feelings about this one. And it has to do, I guess, with a couple of things. For one, I did record a lengthy segment a few weeks ago about Ada Limon's poetry, making fun of her. I called her, as Carmine Starnino seized upon, the thinking woman's Rupi Kaur. I don't take back anything I said about her poetry. It's not for me, but I can't find it in me. I can't find it in myself to be mad at her or to resent her. She's partly just because she seems so nice. I don't think, when I think about Ada Limon, I don't really want to read her poems. But, as I said in that episode, I think the people who say they like her poems do like her poems. I think people do take pleasure from them. I think they speak about them in sometimes unnecessarily lofty terms. I think that if you read the assignment of the poet laureateship as the laurel, I don't know how you the poet's laurels. If you read that as a recognition of great artistic merit, then this announcement seems a little bit silly. If you were to understand it to mean that she is the best poet in America, well, I think, it's hard to be any madder about that than it is about Amanda Gorman's appointment to read a poem at the inauguration. I think that, plenty of people genuinely like Ada Limon's poetry, and I don't think that she's a fraud. I think she writes poems I think she writes the best poems she thinks she can write. And I think a lot of people enjoy them and buy her books and recommend her books or give them to people out of a genuine desire to share their pleasure with others. And that all seems pretty right-headed, like kind of the right thing to happen with poetry. It's just that there isn't that much to it. But, it occurred to me, I thought like, all right, so how would I feel about this if instead of Ada Limon, it were Ocean Vuong or Ben Lerner or Kaveh Akbar, to pick three obvious names. And I think, I don't think I could be as sanguine about it as I can be with Ada Limon, just because I don't feel the same basic fondness. I mean, she just seems like such a sweet, good person, and so well-meaning. Like, I don't think there's any denial or bad faith going on with her. I think the only bad faith is going on with her admirers is when they try to convince themselves that this is important art or high art of some kind. But if it's just as I think Jonathan pointed out, this is an honest-to-God poetic guilty pleasure, which a while ago I perhaps foolishly claimed did not exist. This is a poetic guilty pleasure. If you just accept it as such, I think like with pop music, we don't have any trouble doing that. And if a pop musician of the guilty pleasure producing variety was named to some sort of high office, I mean, that's the thing. We don't have a pop musician. We don't have a pop musician laureateship because we don't need to. Because the poet laureateship is another example, I guess, of a kind of as Alice and Brian have pointed out, a sort of an art generic affirmative action program, right? Like it's important that we all remember and think about and read more poetry, and that's why we have a poet laureateship, I guess, because you don't need to do that with the actually popular art form. So I don't really, both because she seems like probably a nice person, and because she, I think, is doing what she believes she's doing. Maybe she thinks it's a little more serious or refined or lasting than it is. But I don't think she's really in denial about anything. I think there's a lot of denial at work with Ocean Vuong and Ben Lerner. Maybe not with Kaveh Akbar. I think he may be more self-aware than the other two, I kind of suspect. I think he's maybe I think he's maybe a little more cynical. I think there's some deep roiling denial with our other boys, Ocean and Ben. But with Ada Limon, I think she's in pretty good faith with herself. This is really the other question, is what is the poet laureateship? Right? I don't think you get paid. If you do, good. She's making money where there were, fine, whatever. But I don't think there's really much money. It's a lot of honor. Certainly, she's going to sell more books as a result. She's going to be able to command speaking fees. So in that sense, there's some real financial compensation. She's also though going to head up national programs to try to get kids to read more poetry, which I think can be good and can be bad, but it's not really something I would want my favorite poets to be doing. There have been plenty of mediocre poets named to the Poet Laureateship before. Billy Collins obviously, leaps to mind, as are, in plenty of others in that vein. But I don't think I would want my favorite poets to have that office, because mostly what that would guarantee is that they wouldn't really be writing much poetry in those years. Probably they would be doing something else. And in most cases, what I really want my favorite poets to be doing is writing poetry. Alicia Stallings won a MacArthur Genius Grant several years ago, and that, to me, that was a cause for unalloyed celebration, because all it meant was that she got a shitload of money, and it made her life easier, because she was, she, in a self-deprecating way, described herself as a Greek housewife in those years. So it certainly made it easier for her to do some good work. I had more mixed feelings when she ran a few years later against Simon Armitage for the Oxford Professorship of Poetry. He ended up winning, as and a lot of Eratospherians and other formalists in America were sad that she wasn't, she didn't finally win. I don't know. I think as Cameron has pointed out, the Oxford Professor of Poetry is a little bit more of a substantial position than Poet Laureate either of the UK or of the US. And I think that in the case of that particular position and in the case of that particular poet, Stallings, in addition to being an excellent poet, is actually a pretty good scholar and a delightful essayist. And so, the product of that assignment is really, 12 public lectures, that may end up later going into a kind of a book. And that, I think, in her case, is something she could have done quite well. I read Armitage's own Oxford poetry professor lectures recently, and they're fine. I owe Ryan a review of them. It's going to take me a minute to get it together, but not mind-blowing, but fine. I think Geoffrey Hill probably wrote less poetry while he was writing his lectures, but his lectures are great, and so I'm glad he did it. And in Stallings' case, I think on balance, she actually could have turned out some pretty great lectures, so maybe that would have been good. But, if you nominated her for Poet Laureate, I think I would say, I hope not. I hope she doesn't get it. Not because she's not, 10 times the poet Ada Limon is, but just because I would rather she write poetry. I hope that makes some sense. Anyway, by my lights, the very best take on this whole affair was the one I got from our good friend Shane, who simply wrote, let me pull it up, who simply wrote this morning, OMG, Limon is the Poet Laureate. Guess you're going to jail. Thanks, Shane. Right as fucking always. There is a heaven, forever, day by day. The upward longing of my soul doth tell me so. There is a hell, I'm quite as sure. For pray, if there were not, where would my neighbors go? That is a short poem called Theology by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and this is Slyricets. Thank you all for listening. I wanted to start this week's episode with a poem, partly because it's right on topic, but also because most of this episode is going to fall into the other intractable problems category. I have been hesitant to put this out. I think this is a really fun. I had a lot of fun with this episode. I think it's an interesting episode. I enjoyed it. It's a two-parter. The first part's going to be here on the main feed, and the second part is going to be on The Secret Show. It is a big, messy episode. It is one that if you are the one listener who really doesn't care for Brian, I don't know if you'll like this one or not. The topic was inspired by the work of two or three poets. One of them, an 18th century Italian genius who celebrated the world over, and one of them, a contemporary American poet who is very well known, but only in conservative circles. But there's very little poetry in today's episode. There is a little bit more than usual of what I generally try to avoid, which is politics, but that's maybe only because we also talk about religion, which is one of the other things you're not supposed to bring up at the table. Initially, this was going to be an episode about belief, or about the existence of God or not. And oddly enough, it ended up being an episode more about the beliefs of others, or how we feel about the beliefs of others. This is the most Brian and I have ever disagreed on this show, or maybe outside this show. It was pretty intense. And the second part includes my vain attempt to smooth things over, which ended up only inflaming them all the more. So we are still very good friends. We get along quite well, and we are on excellent terms, even in this conversation. But we do really strongly disagree. We don't disagree about our politics or our vision of the universe. We do very strongly, however, disagree about the beliefs of others. So I used to listen to this podcast on Slate that was all about parenting. I can't remember what it was called, but it was hosted by, I believe, Allison Benedict and Dan Kois, or Kois. I don't know how to say his name. In any event, he sort of notoriously in one episode of this podcast said something that got him a lot of, he wasn't necessarily proud of it, but if he was honest with himself, he had to acknowledge that he felt a certain amount of disdain for parents who stay at home with their kids rather than working for money outside the house, or I guess inside the house. But he confessed a disdain for stay-at-home parents. Now, when I heard this, it fucking infuriated me. I was so angry about this. It made me really dislike him, and it just made my blood boil. Now, Allison Benedict, if memory serves, objected to what he said, and he got a lot of grief from other listeners about it. As time went on, though, it occurred to me that I was actually sort of grateful for what he had said. Not because I think he's right to have disdain for stay-at-home parents, but because I think he's really, really far from being alone. I think a lot of people have disdain for stay-at-home parents. I think particularly a lot of people in his in the kind of world that he exists in, of upper middle class, educated liberals who have every reason, who have been thoroughly trained to look on all lifestyle, socioeconomic, parenting choices with equal favor and with an absolutely egalitarian vision of the work and lifestyle and child rearing. And yet, as he acknowledged, he felt deep down an unavoidable contempt for people who made this particular choice. And I was really, I now looking back, I'm really glad that he said that. It's one of the reasons I got to like Chapo Trap House, which I know lots of people dislike for lots of very good reasons. But part of what I really appreciated about them early on was that they were willing to say something about men in my generation that, oddly, a lot of other people dance around. A lot of other people, plenty of people complain about millennials. Plenty of people complain that that men or the patriarchy or white men in particular are fucked up or have problems, or are mediocre and overly self-confident and all these. And there's truth to all of that. But what the guys of Chapo Trap House were willing to say was simply that we're failures. They just used the word failure. And hearing that spoken aloud in frank terms was refreshing. So I promise I'm not buttering you up to try to convince you to like me despite terrible things I'm going to say. In fact, I suspect that the people who will get angriest at me for this episode are going to be the people on the liberal end of things. We do talk about atheism, we talk about religion, we talk about Catholicism versus Protestantism, we talk about Judaism, secular Judaism, kosher laws, we talk about abortion, we talk about Marxism, we talk about gun control, and again, we talk about Biden and Obama, Trump, I think. Yeah, we do mention Trump at some point. We talk about northern snobbery. A lot of things come up. But again, I think the goal, the aim, the heart of the whole question is what we think of the beliefs of others when we genuinely disagree. It's one thing to say you tolerate others, or you celebrate diversity, or to shrug at trivial beliefs or disagreements that don't especially matter, minor preferences. But when you have a fundamental disagreement about the nature of reality with someone else, I think it's a difficult question what that actually means for how you view that person. And that is what Brian and I end up getting into in pretty messy depth today. So I hope that you will appreciate our conversation. I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed having it. And as I said, I thought it would be nice to start this episode out with a poem. So once more, this is Theology by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Part of what I like about this poem is that he wrote a lot of very straightforwardly Christian poetry. He was a Christian, and he wrote plenty of poems that fairly straightforwardly celebrate Christ and mercy and forgiveness and God's willingness to accept the flaws of his children and so on. Part of what I like about this poem, I read this poem at the beginning of a reading recently, and I said at the reading a little bit glibly that I liked this poem because he was mean in it. And he does have some good mean poems. There's another one called Prometheus I want to read at some point that's just really funny about contemporary poetry. But in this one, he is, he does take a crack at his neighbors. But, I think the real butt of this joke is the speaker. There is a heaven forever, day by day. The upward longing of my soul doth tell me so. There is a hell, I'm quite as sure. For pray, if there were not, where would my neighbors go? And there's a nice, there are a couple of nice things about this. The double entendre of pray, the fact that the first line is metrically more ragged than the third line. The second line has a whole extra foot when compared to the fourth line, so that as with X.J. Kennedy's Nothing in Heaven Functions as It Ought, the the rendering of the paradise is more metrically irregular and inconsistent than the slick and efficient vision of hell. But here, I think there's another nice symmetry in that what indicates to the speaker that there is a heaven is the feeling in his soul, the upward longing of my soul, his desire to ascend. That's what actually informs him that this celestial afterlife is waiting for him. And then similarly, what makes him so sure that there is a hell is his feelings about his neighbors, which he doesn't even have to explicitly name. They are clear enough to us already. I like this poem because it's funny, it's snappy, it's smart, it's elegant, but also because, he is not merely taking a crack at his neighbors, nor is he merely taking a crack at people who believe in heaven and hell. I don't take his rendering of the speaker's faith as being cynical. I think he had faith. I think he's laughing at himself without disavowing himself. I think he can recognize that he does believe in heaven, and maybe he believes in hell too. But also these beliefs are tied up in some feelings that he has that may be a little more terrestrial in nature. Anyway, Brian and I get into a lot of that in our conversation. I'm going to talk in depth about all of the source material. But again, if you are a member of the very small but disproportionately influential faction of Slee Ricketts listeners who lives in my house and would prefer that on the podcast we do nothing but agree with each other and talk about reality television, then this episode might not be your favorite. But I hope you may... I hope at least some of you will enjoy it. And for those of you who really want to get back to the poetry brass tacks, I promise I will have some very crunchy poetry-focused episodes coming for you very soon. Now, and again, the first half of this conversation is going to be on the main feed, and the second half is going to appear on the secret show. So you just go to sleericketts.substack.com. You can sign up for a very cheap monthly rate of $2.50 to get access to this and a slew of other bonus episodes. Enough stalling. Here is the episode that might finally shut this podcast down. I hope you enjoy it. So there's a little bit of a backstory to this weird, highly divisive episode. I figure, given that I've done a really good job of inadvertently cultivating a loyal base of conservative Christians, that's
what I was wondering. Not only do you have for conservative Christians, but it seems like you have truly listeners who like and respect you are conservative Christians. So is this the way to just blow that up?
So I also think you and I will have weird disagreements about this.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I think that the core of our difference is I think one person with whom I occasionally interact, whom I believe might believe in God. So if I occasionally interact with, say, 500 people,
right,
I think one of them says he believes in God, but I don't know. And he's
very conservative,
Episcopal
I'm sure.
priest,
very Republican, I'm sure. And
no. He's certainly a Democrat, but he's an Episcopal priest. Other than him,
right.
And in this, I include my own rabbi. I don't. Right. Think I know anybody who believes in God. So I think that might be a main differentiator between our approaches on this.
Yeah. And we also live in a very liberal bubble here, but it's just by virtue of being in the South, it's definitely more friendly to, I know a lot of sort of cash believers and then some very devout ones, and I grew up in a very religious community, and again, in Atlanta, which is not the South, but which is a lot more the South than New York is.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a religious community as well, not community, in a religious family. I mean, my maternal grandparents kept an entirely kosher home, and
Mm.
like both my parents grew up knowing they would marry another Jew. My great grandparents didn't speak any English; they just spoke Yiddish on my mother's side, and like the Judaism is, if not, core, if not the entirety of their self-conception, certainly core to it. So
Yeah, but Judaism also is like not just faith, right? I mean, it's this other
well,
big
right,
thing.
and that I think is where I've been able to differentiate pretty clearly. Like I also think Judaism is something from which I couldn't run away. Like you meet
Yeah.
me and 5 minutes later, I'm a New York Jew. So like what
What
would it
happens in five
mean?
minutes? Like I feel like
They
you
hear
either
me
know
pronounce some
instantly.
words and
Well,
they
no, but like
look
you
at,
know, like very soon, or you know,
oh,
like never. Like Joanna
well,
would
I might
never
not
know, or you
speak.
were like
I
Joanna would
think I
think you're in the
think
mafia, and I'm like,
well, that's just sort of generally white ethnic. Joanna's still all non-wasps are black. Like it's
right?
we have not yet become white in her
Indeed,
conception.
yeah.
But no, I am interested in how we are going to agree and disagree. We're going to discuss an atheist tract entitled "Why I Am Not a Christian," written in 1927 by Bertrand Russell. And then we are, or maybe before, in some order, we are also going to talk about James Matthew Wilson's essay in the Catholic World Report, which I'd like to hear more about, entitled "Science, Prayer, and the Density of Being," which was like written yesterday.
Yes,
What is your?
and it's
Do you
not a
do you have
totally
any?
fair matchup because Bertrand Russell is like one of the leading logicians of the 20th century and like wrote the Principia Mathematica and was like Ludwig Wittgenstein's teacher, and James Matthew Wilson is a very smart young poet critic guy. But like I also think like I think they're more similar than you might, and also like I only read the Why I'm Not a Christian and recommended it to Brian because I had heard the title of it before. So if there are any like thoughtful religious people who think like, oh, you should really be comparing it to this, recommend that. However, don't recommend the fucking Summa Theologica because I want to read, like, I want something short I can read for an I don't want to
Right,
read like a
right.
500-page thing that I can then cogitate on. This is a fucking podcast, so recommend something
But
short.
why are we doing this at all? Like, what is?
Okay, well, I can tell you why it came, why it got stuck in my craw, and it's
Please.
actually a poetry reason. My because I only read periodicals that mention my name. I my good friend Ryan mentioned my book very nicely in a letter to the editor of First Things magazine, which is a very Catholic magazine. It's also like a very like learned magazine. So his mention of me is not actually important in this case. He mentioned it in response to this essay on Leopardi. He's a great Italian poet. I've read not nearly as much of Leopardi as I should. Really good essay on him. It's called Nihilism for the Iron-Hearted. It's by Algus Valunas. It came out in the June 22 or April 22 issue, and then a couple months later, Ryan wrote this letter in. I'm going to save Ryan's letter because I feel like after all of the vitriol, we may need a moment of like salve and solace from him. But I read Ryan's nice note. I read the original article, and then Valunas, like a dick, wrote a letter back to Ryan in which the gist of the letter is like, actually, nice try, Mr. Wilson, and good effort, but we should look down on atheists and pity them and not read them because reading them is dangerous. And he says, unbelief rarely stems from disinterested clarity. Hate, hold on. What's going on, Ellie, baby? I'm having this meeting. What's going on, baby? So after a brief interruption from my adorable but annoying children, so Valunas writes in his just infuriating letter to the editor, unbelief rarely stems from disinterested clarity. Hate tends to have a lot to do with it, and most haters of God have a particular grievance that clouds their thinking. Just fucking infuriating.
So
Infuriating.
I think we have to continue the meta conversation just for another like 10 seconds until
Yeah.
you're surrounded by people who sincerely believe these things. Like one of your closest friend believes that like Jesus was a human and also a God,
And
right?
I did believe that for still most of my life.
But how is that tolerable to you?
But I
How do you
think
find
people,
yourself that you're not constantly humoring or placating?
I think most Ryan has a thing about atheism and like faux atheism versus true atheism. I think like very few people actually believe anything, and like most of the thing, like whether you're nominally a believer in God or nominally an atheist or agnostic or whatever, like mostly you're just sort of serving your pseudo-Freudian self-interest. And like there's a thing I want to talk about later, which I think both of these essays like really, really badly mix up, which is what we wish were true versus what we think is true.
Yes,
And
I had the exact same note, especially on your boy James
oh yeah,
Matthew
yeah,
Wilson.
he does it. I think Russell does it more subtly, but I think they both do it, and I think that's what most people who say they believe or don't believe anything do most of the time.
Okay, that's a good answer. The reason why you're able to live in a world full of believers is you live in a world full of every sort of people, and you don't think that believing in Christ matters particularly compared to believing in the Republican Party or believing in angels or believing in
or
that animal in reincarnation or
like hardcore dedicated Marxist beliefs have a similarly utopian kind of trajectory that like I think I find a lot of it credible and convincing and a lot of it batty, and I like, just as with Christianity, like I find a lot really credible and valuable and I grew up with it, but I also find a lot of it to be fucking insane. We should probably start with the Russell because it comes like 100 years earlier. So this is Bertrand Russell had this. It was originally a lecture he gave to the South London branch of the National Secular Society in Battersea Town Hall on March 6th in 1927. He gave this lecture called "Why I Am Not a Christian."
So you assume that based on the group to whom he's speaking, that they believe not dissimilarly from what we believe, that he is, forgive this in pun intended, he is preaching to the choir, right? Just as
I think so.
The anti-choir. And I think most of what he's doing is trying to entertain.
Yes, and I think he does a pretty good job of that.
There's some great lines. There's some really funny lines.
Yeah, the one big advantage this has over the James Matthew Wilson, apart from being mostly, I just agree with it more, is it's a lot funnier.
Why don't you explain what his basic framework of argumentation is, and then we can delve into the specifics.
Yeah, so he starts in, I think, a pretty reasonable way with an attempt to define Christianity. He actually does something similar to what C.S. Lewis does in his book Mere Christianity, which is to say, well, lots of people are Christians, and that means a million different things to different people, but it might be worth kind of identifying the lowest common denominator. Like you must at least have this in order to be a Christian. And you can argue about whether he gets it right or not, but he says that to be a Christian, you must, 1, believe in God and immortality, and 2, believe that Christ was, if not divine, at least the best and wisest of men. So like if you may and probably do believe lots of other things and do lots of other things, but if you don't at least believe both of those things, he would say it's really hard to call you a Christian in anything other than a demographic sense.
I feel like the first one, you must believe in God and immortality, is very sensible in defining what a Christian is. Mm-hmm. I think you must believe that Christ was, if not divine, at least the best and wisest of men, is almost entirely a setup to a series of punchlines that he will deliver later on.
Yes, and I should say that there are, I want to say a few different Christian writers and thinkers have said versions of this. I'm sure somebody said it first and best, but the Christian response to arguments that like, well, Jesus had a lot of good points, but which plenty of secularists do say, the classic Christian response to that is no, either he was God or he was a madman.
Right. Exactly. And that's why you have to believe that Jesus, if not divine, was the wisest of men. You're right. Feels like a straw man, ridiculous setup because,
but he also has he gets some pretty good punchlines out of it.
Oh, 100%. I just think that it's the first argument is him actually doing argumentation. Yeah. And the second part is him setting him up to do shtick. So if he sets up as these are the two things you must believe to be a Christian, how does he argue that
Right.
therefore you have to be a fool to be a Christian?
Yeah. So he doesn't really address immortality. He addresses immortality, I guess, sort of obliquely at most, but mostly his essay is about, or his lecture is about different. He doesn't say he's going to address all of the arguments for God because there are God knows how many, but there are a number of prominent arguments for God's existence, and he kind of addresses several of those, and then he turns to, okay, well, apart from that, was Christ both the best and the wisest of men? And I actually think he makes a lot of, for being a logician, he makes some pretty big logical missteps in his, particularly in that second part. But
For sure.
he talked, I don't think we need to break down all of his arguments against the arguments, because in part, like, as he even acknowledges, like, rational arguments for the existence of God feel a little bit like a necessarily post hoc exercise. Like,
Totally. And a lot
yeah,
of his argumentation is varieties of the first cause argument,
yeah,
where a lot of what he returns to, he says that they're different. Like, how can you prove there's the natural law argument, which is like, we say things are so great, but like they're not really so great. So we could do something with God. Argument from design, things seem like they're designed really well, but like there are other examples of why they could be designed well. And the
yeah.
first cause argument, which was it Aquinas who loves the first cause argument? Sorry, I really should not be doing this because I know that whoever is listening to you is like poking fucking sticks and needles in their
And that
inner
sums up
ears
Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, and is Aquinas the first cause guy? And like, one, he's not, and two, like, he wrote a gazillion pages, and like people believe their entire lives defined by what this guy thought about things. So I will take a step back from that, and I'm not going to name check Aquinas. But his basically with the first cause is like, well, if God made everything, who made God? Which is like a very obvious retort to God being the first cause.
Yeah. He's less interesting as a logician here, as throughout, as he is as a rhetorician. He says in his one knock on the Hindus, mostly he takes on the Christians. He says, "It is exactly of the same nature as the Hindus' view, that the world rested upon an elephant, and the elephant rested upon a tortoise. And when they said, 'How about the tortoise?' the Indian said, 'Suppose we change the subject.'"
Like, I don't know. Yeah. I don't think a lot of Hindus would be like, "Yep, that pretty much sums up my religious belief."
No.
There's a
No, I
big
mean,
thing
that's
on a
like,
smaller thing, and on the smaller thing, let's go have lunch. Like, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, so much of it is just sort of like he's just very dry and funny, and not necessarily giving anybody a fair shake. But that's not necessarily his point, as you said. He's mostly trying to entertain people who already agree with him, I think.
So there are two defenses of believing in God that I have come across in my life that I find are tolerable.
Okay.
One of them I probably incorrectly associate with William James, and another one I probably incorrectly associate with my Rabbi Josh.
Okay.
So what I am going to say is the William James's argument, which I am certain was both not written by William James and is not a good form of the argument, is that like, it's like the leave me alone. I've had some experiences. Those experiences were religious. You can't tell me they weren't. So go away, and I believe in God.
Yeah.
And that's like, all right. Like, I don't.
Yeah. Well, that's a good response to somebody who's trying to proselytize atheism. Right. Like, if you're trying to convince someone not to believe in God, then like, let me live my life is a pretty good response to that.
Right.
Right. But that's not the same thing as saying like leave me alone because I've had religious experiences and this is how I like understand reality is different than saying like, let me make you believe because I've had some
totally. It falls short of that. But me, I'm really like, I'm being as generous as I can be here. And for me, somebody saying like, I believe, and also faith fits in that. Like if it's just like, I have faith, like there's nothing you can say about that.
No. Yeah.
Like, all right, that's cool. Like you have faith. And I think part of the reason why I'm so fairly or unfairly dismissive towards truly religious people who have had access to non-religious institutions, like I am not particularly bitter towards fundamentalists in terms of their belief, because they are for the most part sheltered from secular life by their parents and teachers and cultures and societies, and therefore it seems totally reasonable to believe what everyone you've ever thought highly of has told you.
And,
I
well,
have
and there are different stripes of, because when you're talking about fundamentalists in that way, you're talking about like
I'm talking about Hasidic Jews,
Hasidic
or
Jews
people
and
who,
like Amish and
yeah,
like extreme fundamentalist Muslims in some
exactly.
places.
I guess that I don't blame people who are cut off from the rest of society for their
Yeah,
beliefs.
sure.
Again, not a particularly dramatic statement, but if you want to say, like, I've been visited by angels, so I believe in the Bible, like, I'm cool with that. And if you
Yeah,
want to say I have a faith that doesn't comport to any, logic or your life, I'm totally cool with that also. I think one of the reasons I am dismissive and at my ugliest in this conversation is I was desperate to believe from the ages of, I don't know, 12 to 16. Like, I was going around trying to find a way to believe any of this could plausibly be true, and I couldn't. So I think I fairly or unfairly associate a lot of believers with a less sophisticated version of my 15-year-old self. And my 15-year-old self was like the most despicable person I've ever met. So I feel like there is a difficult obstacle I need to get around to have this conversation kindly.
yes,
So anyway, the first category I'm falsely attributing to William James, which is like, I have my own thing. I believe in this stuff.
yeah.
And it's a lot bigger than William James,
Yeah.
but that's probably
It's
where
it's
I've
hard
read
to
it in its
argue with
most
that
compelling way.
for the sake of
Exactly.
personal belief. Yeah.
My second type of belief, which probes a little bit more aggressively, is saying I don't believe in God. A counterpoint that Josh Stanton, who is the rabbi of my synagogue and whom I really like and respect, says is like, in what God do you not believe, is his counterpoint. And
Sure.
he's sort of saying, like, so you don't believe in a anthropomorphized arbiter and ruler of all things, like, neither does he. And you don't believe
Yeah.
in a omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent God, like, neither does
Yeah.
he. But do you believe? And then you can reach some point where religion
It's hard to
religion
argue.
is sort
Yeah.
of undifferentiatable from, like, consciousness or
Yeah.
or secular morality, or like the fact that there's value in our life. And like, I do believe in versions of that. And if you want to push me, like, when that consciousness or like trying to be kind is just my vocabulary for religious people using the word God, like, I'm okay with that also.
Yeah.
But that defangs almost all of it for me. But again, I don't think the purpose of religion should be defanging atheism. So I have that fits into the category that you said I was talking about earlier also, which is like, yes, that's a decent point against pure secular atheism, but it doesn't speak on behalf of religion particularly well.
No, and I think it is certainly where I think Russell gets his hook in pretty accurately is like, that does do away with immortality, and like, that's so much part of the bargain for so many believers, not Jews traditionally. I know
Immortality is where everything falls apart. Like, I spent a lot of time thinking that Buddhism might make sense, because the life is suffering and trying not to focus on suffering. Like, that corresponds more to my vision of the world than Judaism in some ways, and Christianity for sure. But really, Buddhism only works with some type of reincarnation or some type of higher consciousness. And I guess you can reach higher consciousness in this life without reincarnation, but so much of the value of that consciousness, that higher plane of consciousness, is to no longer be in that cycle of reincarnation. And like, why would reincarnation be true? Like, why would heaven be true? Like, like that's where it all falls apart to me. And I don't see James Matthew Wilson, but it's a lot to put on James Matthew Wilson. I've never heard an argument on behalf of life beyond life that has been at all satisfying to me at all.
No.
Have you?
No, I mean, probably the best arguments I've heard are like Socrates as ventriloquized by Plato, but I don't find them convincing. Like they're like get close to sort of like pure arguments, but they still
to me it
like,
gets close to sophistry, which is what they always claim they're the opposite of.
Socrates
right?
does a lot of sophistry. Yeah.
Right. That's fair. But I would put the religious talk within that.
Yeah, oh, definitely.
That sophistry.
Like, I find it like, not convincing, but I find it more respectable as an argument than a lot of arguments for.
So Bertrand Russell takes a lot of cracks at Christ, which is funny. He titles this section "Defects in Christ's Teachings," and he says how like it's fucked up to believe in hell because like that's a vicious, inhumane just thing to think about humans. But he gets really funny when he starts like quoting Christ. You know, you will find in Gospels Christ said, "Ye serpents, ye generations of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell?" And then out of quotes, Russell says, "That was said to people who did not like his preaching. It is not really, to my mind, quite the best tone." he's you know, to quote "ye serpents, ye generation of vipers," and then to take a step back and saying like, "I don't approve of that register there," or then Christ says, "The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth," unquote. And then Russell writes, and he goes on and on about the wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Yeah. I think my favorite of these is, "There is the instance of the Gadarene swine, where it certainly was not very kind to the pigs to put the devils into them and make them rush down the hill to the sea. You must remember that he was omnipotent, and he could have made the devils simply go away."
That's pretty good. I like the fig tree one more, though.
The fig tree,
where Christ is like irrationally furious about the fig tree. So he comes to it and he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. And Jesus answered and said unto it, "No man eat fruit of the tree hereafter forever." And Peter saith unto him, "Master, behold the fig tree which thou cursedest is withered away." And then Russell comes in and says, "This is a very curious story, because it wasn't the right time of year for figs, and you couldn't really blame that on the tree." Like, which is both. I mean, I think the funny line there is quoting like biblical wrath and exaggeration, and then following it up with like demure British culture.
It's what comedy writers call like the high-low contrast, right?
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
He has good shtick. That's what, you know.
Exactly.
I think he made, like, as a logician, I think there are a ton of problems with a bunch of these arguments. Like, I think for one, he super messes up he makes a point earlier that it's ridiculous to believe that there must be a heaven and a hell because the world is so unjust that in order for there to be justice, there must be an afterlife in which things become where things become just. And he has a great line about.
Are you talking about the oranges?
The oranges, yes. That's another. He says, "Supposing you got a crate of oranges that you opened, and you found all the top layer of oranges bad. You would not argue the underneath ones must be good so as to redress the balance. You would say probably the whole lot is a bad consignment." And I think like that's reasonable thinking. But then later on, he says, it is so despicable of Jesus to believe in hell because what a mean thought. It would be so mean for there to be a hell. I think, well, that's not why people, like, if it's a true belief, like I don't believe in flesh-eating viruses. I don't believe in like those weird wasps that like plant parasitic things and like caterpillars and eat them alive. Like, I don't believe in those things because I want them to be true. I believe that they're simply true. So he makes that confusion a lot. You know, I've always kind of liked the fig tree story. It's partly because it is so ridiculous, and partly because I read it as a fucking parable. Like I think there's like one tiny degree of difference between like him telling a story about a fig tree not being ripe, and then somebody writing down like, and then he smote the fig tree. Like totally. I think like it's an interesting parable, and that's all that matters to me. You know.
And what you were talking about with heaven and hell, I think it gets to the point that I find most difficult about reading this, in the same way that I find it very difficult to read arguments about politics with which I entirely agree, because it's like, here's a long list of reasons why women should have the right to terminate pregnancies in the first trimester. Sure. Like, I don't need a list of those
Right.
arguments.
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
of course women should have the right to do that,
Sure,
you know,
sure, yeah.
or like I don't like why should we be able to have AK-47 like
Right.
sorry is it 47 AK-47
AK-47, yeah.
yeah
AR-15 is the one everybody gets mad about right now.
right
But yeah.
but it's like why should people shouldn't have those
I think
because they lead
AK-47s
to
are already illegal, I think. Or I think
Well,
like
again,
most
this is
people
why-
can't own them, yeah. Like in the US. But
Right.
anyway, go on, yeah.
my point is when I read those articles saying like guns of war should not be considered
Sure.
part of the Second
Yeah,
Amendment.
yeah. You don't need to
I
read
don't
them.
need a lot of examples for that. Like I already agree. And that was part of what I found frustrating about this Bertrand Russell piece, that he's not going farther than like making fun of people who already disagree with what I disagree with, except he writes this very strange thing about science at the end, which I found as uncompelling as his thing about religion. So
Yeah.
he says,
oh yeah, oh god, yeah,
he says
yeah.
science can help us. So he feels like he needs to like put in an answer at the end because he spends so much time taking away what people believe in. And he says science can help us to get over this craven fear in which mankind has lived for so many generations. Previously he blames that fear for causing religion. Science can teach us, and I think our own hearts can teach us, no longer to look round for imaginary supports, the implication there is religion, no longer to invent allies in the sky, God, but rather to look to our own efforts here below to make this world a fit place to live in, instead of the sort of place that the churches in all these centuries have made it.
Yeah.
How is science going to do that? Like, I don't,
well,
like
and I'll tell you
maybe, but like, you're not explaining any of that. Like there's no, that's no more like rationally solid than religion.
No, I mean he says at one point, you find this curious fact that the more intense has been the religion of any period, the more profound has been the dogmatic belief, the greater has been the cruelty, and the worse has been the state of affairs. And that was said 5 years after Stalin took power in Russia and 6 years before Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany. So like that's silly and
it's totally silly and suggesting that the reason why science hasn't created a utopia is because of religion and not because we don't know how to create utopias is just silly. You know, so it's like it leaves me thinking that like, okay, like you just tore apart this system of beliefs that you don't believe in and that I don't believe in and that I don't know anybody who believes in, but like you don't have any more answers. You're just a nihilist like the rest of us. And
right, yeah. He says at one point that like it's so ridiculous that religious people think religion makes men virtuous. It doesn't make men virtuous. But then he goes on to say, like, I guess, like, getting rid of religion and increasing, like, the acceptance of science makes people virtuous. And my response is, like, nothing makes people virtuous.
Exactly.
Like, people in the past, like, religious civilizations historically have been worse because most of them have been religious so far. And, like, we will be, like, nothing makes people virtuous. Right? It took me back to your argument. Like, all trends are fake. Like,
right.
Like, there are no trends. People are always, there are some good people. Most people are so-so, and there's some horrible people, and they're gonna find whatever society they live in, whatever belief structure they encounter, they're going to find new reasons to be horrible to each other. But that's not native to religion. But neither is
and that's also not to say that
religion.
there aren't certain belief structures that are worse
really
than
bad.
others.
Oh, totally.
Right. Like belief structures that oppress the majority of the people so a minority can live better are worse belief structures than those who allow more people to have happier lives. But that I agree often can correspond with religion, but then you have the correlation, causation argument.
Yeah,
sort of
I think
that's
where I get very Marxist, where I think like a lot of belief structures, especially as they're taught over time, tend to correlate pretty strongly to like the interests of those who have the most power,
including Marxism.
Oh, yeah, in some cases. Yeah.
Right. So that's where it gets, yes.
No, like I'm saying like but like, I mean, this is partly why I like reading people who have big, all comprehensive theories of the world, not because I want to accept any of them, but because I find they often like show me an interesting new way to look at things. And I think like that's why like Marxism is totally a useful way. Like it's a really good critique. It's a really bad proposal has been my experience with it.
Okay, but like, then where does this James Matthew Wilson piece help you find new ways of looking at things? Are you familiar with him as a poet? Is this somebody
Yes.
you've read?
So, yes. So I discovered him in graduate school. And I read probably, I think, every one of his like 80,000 word essays on avant-garde and experimental poetry in the Contemporary Poetry Review. He's a very smart and learned critic. He's way more learned than I am. I have not read enough of his poetry to say of what I've read. I'd say he's a better critic than a poet.
What does he feel about avant-garde poetry?
He tends to think that it is not worthwhile. But
well, that's what I would assume. I was hoping you were going to say the opposite.
No, well, but I'll say like he definitely goes to the trouble of pretty deeply understanding what he's talking about before. Like it's certainly not like vitriol. Like Joan Houlihan is also fun to read, but she's more of a firebrand who's sort of fun in a cathartic way. His essays, I will say, have the virtue of being sort of boring in that they like, well, let's really try to understand this.
Right.
So like I think he's a pretty smart critic. I think his great weakness and his strength as a critic is that he's an almost cripplingly systematic thinker. And I think in this case, this argument, this particular essay made me crazy, but reading it helped me identify some of the problems that I think were in the Russell essay. So I think he's way less entertaining than Russell. He's way less funny. He's way less of a good rhetorician, but I think he makes almost all the same mistakes that Russell does.
How did you find this?
I don't even remember. It popped up when I think like I was searching for the First Things article, and this popped up somehow. But It was like in some string of searches for something else related to poetry or religion or whatever, it popped up. But like,
so how does he make the same mistakes?
I've been aware of him for a while.
Great. So how does he make the same mistakes as Russell?
So he takes up I'll just read the beginning because it's like it's a maddening beginning to an article. He says, "The other night I watched a few minutes of the comedian Ricky Gervais' new comedy show. Early in, he does a bit about his atheism and his willingness nonetheless to abide expressions of religious devotion. By way of example, he says, if one of my family is very ill, they say, I'll pray for them. I say, thanks very much, because it's a nice gesture. If they say, we also canceled the chemotherapy, I'd go, don't do that. Let's do the praying and the chemotherapy, shall we? Gervais' audience laughs, but most people would not find this a very perceptive bit of humor. Who exactly are these religious persons who think that prayer should be a substitute for medicine and that the two are somehow mutually exclusive? And like the answer to that question is, well, like Christian Scientists and Jehovah's Witnesses. But like,
right. I mean, there is an answer to that.
It is a straw. Like it's a very, very small minority of religious people.
But why is he using this weird hook to write this essay?
Because it's
a joke. I mean, who takes anything Ricky Gervais says seriously? Like Ricky Gervais. The reason why that joke is funny is in the Netflix special, he uses different voices for the different characters.
He's a good comedian. His timing is delivery.
Right. So he sneaks in very quickly. Yeah. We also canceled the chemotherapy. That's like a surprising thing to hear. Yeah, so it makes you laugh because you think he's going to do anti-religious stuff because that's what he's known for, but instead he talks about how these people who he just said did a nice gesture wants to cancel the chemotherapy, and he says it in like a fast way that is, a little like making fun of himself and like it's just good delivery, so it's a joke.
I think James Matthew Wilson is making sort of the same mistake that a lot of people make when they attack comedy from the left for being insufficiently virtuous. I think
totally.
But yeah, it's a totally silly way to start an essay about why atheism is fundamentally more impoverished than theism. He does something Bertrand Russell does a fair amount of, which is play a lot of word games. Like this, both of these essays felt to me at times like the peak of philosophy as like pointless verbal dithering.
Totally agree. I have an example on page 1. I don't know whether you have a different example, but in where I first got very frustrated with his logic is he writes in Gervais's first comment, the one that you and I have just been discussing, he seems to assume that the causes of things must be singular. And so multiple claims about causes must be mutually exclusive, with one being true and the other false. So just to tease that out a little bit, that is in the joke. In the joke, he's saying the thing that will cure cancer is chemotherapy, not prayer. So if you want to pray, go ahead and pray, but make sure the thing that cures cancer is going on too, the chemotherapy. But why would that be that the causes of all things therefore must be singular? So you think that joke implies that Ricky Gervais couldn't say that, like, the reason I fall in love with her is because I find her pretty and funny? Like, it doesn't make any sense. No, it's just like a massive
there's a name
for
that. There's a name for that logical fallacy that basically is like trying to generalize the specific in a way that, that is not fair.
My question about all of this, because is why did he write? What is this? What type of what genre is this? Like I think
this is the extreme weakness of his systematic mind. I think because I do take him to be someone who writes in very good faith. I think he probably literally saw this. I'm going to speculate in a way that's probably not kind, but like I think he probably saw this special, started off in a rant to his wife. His wife said, "I need to put the kids to bed." Go ahead. And then he sat down and he worked out all the implications. And he is smart and he knows all the implications. And then he is the equivalent of like Ada Limon or Garth Greenwell in a certain context in which, like, just because he wrote this, somebody was going to publish it. In like the conservative, Catholic, educated poetry world, he can get anything he writes published, just the way as plenty of people in a different world can.
But presumably there was an editor.
Nope. I would bet money there was not.
Really?
In any meaningful way.
What does this mean? So this is on my page 4 of 5, but it's in the paragraph that starts with the word oneness. It's the final 3 sentences. I don't think you're going to be able to follow it if I read it out loud. I guess everybody in the podcast will have to, so you can deal with that as well. But tell me what this means at a literal level. Because the truth about something must be understood in terms of its causes, and the final cause, the purpose of its being, is the most important one. All beings are also good. If we could not perceive goodness in things, we could not perceive the truth about them either. Goodness must therefore be the third property common to all beings.
Yeah,
I don't know what any of those words mean in that order.
Yeah. I mean, he's taking. So I get lost in that too, totally. And I think here's my suspicion is that from a purely scholarly perspective, because he is reading, and I would guarantee you he's read all this stuff in great depth and with great learning. He's taking some of these terms from Aristotle when it comes to goodness, or that may have been Aquinas, maybe doing the same thing you were doing earlier. But my guess is that in a scholarly fashion, that checks out because he's so good at that. But it means fuck all to any like reasonable reader who's just coming upon it without being like deep in the textual weeds with him. So I think that's how this whole article came out. I think his incredibly powerful systematic mind got going and he couldn't turn it off. And then somebody said, okay, I'll publish it as is. And I think like that like, this is a far less prominent venue and a far less prominent writer than, say, Garth Greenwell's silly comments in LitHub. But just as I think with Garth Greenwell, like he has clearly written lots of smart and worthwhile things, but he's also in a position where like he can just sort of gush something out and it'll get published. That's the same thing that happens in this other world of like conservative literary thought. I think like James Matthew Wilson has many smart and worthwhile things to write and say. This is not one of them, but it gets published anyway. And it's partly because he's preaching to the choir, and partly just because he's fucking the smartest guy in the room. And so they say, okay, whatever. Like
he's making love with the smartest guy in the room, or he's fucking. He
oh
fucking
yeah, no, sorry.
Is
he
the
is.
Smartest guy
He
in
is.
the
I mean, I think he is the smartest guy in many of the rooms he's in, and maybe most of the rooms he's in.
So what's the?
He also does a thing that Bertrand Russell does like explicitly, which is tell a cute story, the moral of which is the person who believes the opposite thing from me is a child. Like explicitly. Like Bertrand Russell says, like Kant was taught to believe in God at his mother's knee, and he sucked it in like milk, and that's why he believes in God. He's a child. And then James Matthew Wilson has a whole thing about like, well, my kids believed that thought the dead snake skin was beautiful, but then they lost interest because they're children and they have a shallow vision of things. But his larger argument seems to be that like whether you're using like Aristotelian math or not to do it, like an atheist vision of the world is fundamentally impoverished compared to a theistic vision of the world. Like that seems to be his sort of basic claim here. It's a thinner, flatter vision of the world. And like I can contest some of his arguments to that effect, but my first response is sort of to step back and say like, well, maybe so, but that doesn't mean it's not the case. Like it seems like a strange...
I mean, that doesn't mean it's real.
Right. I mean, it's the same thing as
Right.
like hell shouldn't... Like it's the same thing as Russell saying like, you shouldn't believe in hell because what a mean thing to believe. He's saying like, you shouldn't believe there's no God because how much more interesting is the world if there is a God?
Is it self-delusion? Or is it...
No. I don't think it's self-delusion. I think it's a failure in both cases to sufficiently imagine the minds of others. I think both of them are saying like the person who disagrees with me is not to be taken seriously as an adult. That was the first half of my conversation with Brian about Leopardi and James Matthew Wilson and Bertrand Russell and company. To hear the second half, go to sleerickets.substack.com and sign up for the secret show. You will get bonus episodes of the show along with maybe I have a question I may be putting to some of the subscribers soon about the logo. So keep an eye out for that. And if you have not yet subscribed, go there now. You won't regret it. Thanks very much to all of you for listening. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.